Okay, so let's get started. This open mic is a tradition we had in NICE since, when was it, 2013, and has always been very interesting and very open-minded, and I hope we can keep this tradition also today. The idea is that we first ask the speakers to give us their opinions on today's session, and maybe also to amplify a little bit the statements they made in their talk. I mean, they can sort of enforce what they said so that it becomes a part of the discussion. Then I hope that some themes emerge out of these initial statements. And the themes that I see from today's contributions are applications, of course, applications of neuromorphic computing, but there's also the aspect of which aspects of biology are relevant for neurocomputing. We had, for example, glial cells, we had dendritic structure. How relevant is that really for computing? Can it just be replaced by simple functions, or do we really need this structure that we observe in biology? So those are two questions which came to my mind, but of course I leave this to the members of the panel. So it's always the question where to start now, and as you don't know the rules, Rick, we start with you, all right? So we go that way. Okay, you just say what you think, not too long, like 2 or 3 minutes. You heard all the talks today?
No, I didn't.
Oh, that's good. So then maybe you can reinforce a little bit the message you had in your talk.
So my message is that one really potentially interesting use of neuromorphic, I mean, it's already happening to some degree in Spinnaker and other things, is as a simulation for computational neuroscience hypotheses and as a testing ground that's faster and cheaper than actually trying to engineer a biological system to behave that way, and yet potentially faster than trying to use a purely software-based system. And I believe that by constraining oneself to trying to do neural simulations with neuromorphic hardware, that you actually will learn something that you don't learn by just trying to do it in software.
So the main question that has been echoing in my ears since yesterday is actually whether the brain is intelligent because of spikes or despite spikes. And I think we should at least consider looking at the two most important time periods in our lives when it comes to creating the brain structure that we carry for the rest of our lives. The first time period is right after we're born. And the second one, believe it or not, some of you might have guessed it already, is during the adolescence time. In these two periods, we have a significant pruning of neural connections that essentially create what we would call in a single word structure. So what you are asking from a deep learning network when you are training it is assuming nothing to wait long enough for the data to shape its structure. This is what training is, and this is why it takes so long. It takes about 10,000 images to train a network to recognize a horse compared to a car, although it will take my 3-year-old daughter a single instance to learn what a horse looks like, with some expected mistakes that she will do when she sees a donkey or something similar. I think I talked more than I should. I'm here to actually hear what the rest will say.
Yeah, maybe I can make up for this by being shorter. I must say, I'm always getting very nervous when neuromorphs dive more into biology, because I think often one gets kind of a little bit of second-hand biology or second-hand neuroscience. If one reads the papers, I think there's much more complexity in the data that one even has dreamed of. And I think one often works with very simplified low-dimensional projections of the actual data from neuroscience. And I'm not convinced that this low-dimensional projection helps you, to unravel, the secrets of intelligence in the brain.
Well, I almost want to just comment on that rather than make my own comment. But
say something interesting. So I can comment on you.
all right. So I think I'm schizophrenic. On the one hand, I am incredibly optimistic. I'm jealous of the young people here, and because they are in the sweet spot. They are born at it seems the exact right moment at which one of the sentient species in the universe crosses this threshold, and it's an amazing time. And the other half of my brain says, but we are so ignorant. We know so little. And some of the hubris that I exhibit, and I think everyone in the field exhibits, is so misplaced. If we really look at how far we are, and I'm optimistic, and yet I can't help but be struck by how far we are from, we throw these terms around like cortex and cortical computation and attention, and we're just lying to ourselves. No way. We're nowhere close to that. And so I don't know but I think we're going to get there. I am optimistic that we're going to break through this, but we need a new approach.
Can I comment on that? Yes, as I said this morning, I also believe we need a new approach. Let me just cite Jeff Hinton. He says that young people forget everything I've ever said, start anew, and I find it a very interesting topic to discuss. Where are we? What is the corner we have to turn?
Well, I'm optimistic, but I've only been in the field a couple of years. And what has struck me yesterday and today is that, clearly this community wants to get something beyond deep neural networks and backprop. And there's a vast number of options, but maybe there's a few candidates that are starting to rise to, at least some level of activity that might lead to a breakthrough. And the talk that particularly struck me, that resonated with what was being said yesterday, is it's not just about integrating at the neuron, that the dendrites have their role to play, and we've got to start thinking about how that enhances the computational power and what we can do with it.
So I want to say that the thing that what I love about today is today was a very neuroscience heavy day, aside from my talk. But I think the most exciting thing that I'm seeing is when I started, deep learning was just on the rise. And for a couple of years, it kind of felt like our field, our little community here, was being drawn towards deep learning. And the most exciting thing I've noticed today, especially, but through the whole meeting, is that there's an increasing appreciation that deep learning is great, it does its thing well. There's so much more interesting stuff you can do with neuromorphic computing than convolutional neural nets. And I think this crowd is way ahead of the community in identifying that, and we're going to benefit from it.
So I'm thinking a lot about, from the viewpoint of an experimental neuroscientist, I think the thing is lacking right now is a true merge of experimental neuroscience and neural-inspired AI or hardware. So we do our experiments, and we care about results. We analyze that data, and we don't think about the theory and how we can help artificial intelligence or even look at AIs. So I think it's... I think both neuroscience and artificial intelligence fall in the same umbrella of, we can call it the study of intelligence. Yeah, of course, neuroscience study disease and things like that, but I think understanding intelligence is one main goal of neuroscience. So I would like to see in the future if there's some kind of research institute train graduate students who do experiments and also who is very good with coding and understanding theory and AI.
So sorry I'm late. I hope I don't repeat things that were already said. But yeah, so what I really liked of today was, I mean, I thought your summary of the dendritic computation was really great and really got us thinking. I think it's important at this point in neuromorphic computing that we really open up to what the new results are in neuroscience in terms of how we can actually use richer dynamics, even if they are not immediately reflected by our current hardwares. But I think that's a very important thing. And what I think also it's important that the message that I try to make is really that we need to study these dynamics more in terms of how they map to computations. And I think we need to get the theorists somehow going, and of course, Christoph is a hero for me because he's doing this for a long time in the field. We need to come up from theoretical principles also. What would we need for computation, and what kind of structured approach do we need, for example, to generalize knowledge, to extract rules, apply them somewhere else? And I think we need to get there, and we need stronger theories also to guide the hardware implementations to really get us into another space which then really outperforms deep learning.
Okay, thank you. So that was the first round. If I can make a summary, I think there's a clear focus in the discussion now, which is how much biology is useful for computation. We heard one statement, which I have heard also probably at each and every NICE conference over the last 6 years, is almost as famous as airplanes don't flap their wings. It is the statement, we know so little. I mean, that is what I hear all the time. And it sort of generates some kind of depression where you say, well, we know so little, so we better don't even get started. I'm exaggerating here. Then I hear Wolfgang who says, well, maybe it's not even so good if the neuromorphic people get too deeply involved in biology because they have a very superficial view of what's going on, which clearly calls for better collaboration, I think, between the sort of the engineering part and the neuroscience part. But the question on what is really required to improve neural computing with biological knowledge, I think is a very important one. And if you want to respond to that, you're all very welcome. Otherwise, I would also ask the audience for. Okay, there are two responses, Brad and then Christoph.
So I want to respond to the we know so little, which I think Gar said. I think we know a lot about neuroscience that has never even broached AI. So neuroscience has this gigantic repository of knowledge and theories that are yet to be mined for AI. So yes, we know very little about the brain compared to what there is to learn. But at the same time, we are not at a loss of deep thoughts and ideas about how the brain functions. Neuroscience, if you bring together the communities, there are a lot of interesting ideas, and we're starting to see that here, that we can make real progress in a real-world application sense by bringing the neuroscience from the past 50 years that has been largely ignored by the AI community into the fold. So I think, yeah, neuroscience is going to keep going as a field forever. It's a long, long time. But we don't need to wait for that to happen. I think there's a lot of opportunity that we can jump into.
Okay, I have Christoph and Fritz and Wolfgang.
I essentially wanted to make the same point. There is a flood of data coming out of neuroscience, and of course it's a great venture, this whole field. But even if the amount of information will grow by a factor of 100, that is not going to force the solution on us. Let us just think back of the 1870s when some physicists came up with a theoretical framework for how to understand thermodynamics in terms of the statistics of atoms. That was not on the basis of any kind of experimental data on atoms. Essentially, the colleagues of those, of Ludwig Boltzmann, for instance, ridiculed him for, have you seen atoms? No, have you seen atoms? There are no atoms for the next 35 years. And the same is going to happen here. Somebody has to sit down and think it out in a principled way, come up with a convincing solution, and then there is good opportunity for experiments to test those proposals.
Boltzmann even committed suicide. I hope this will not happen.
Yeah, so,
No, Fritz and Wolfgang.
okay. Yeah, so I know the neuroscience side much better, actually, than actually the neuromorphic. I mean, I'm pretty new, actually, to the second time I'm here. And so on the neuroscience side, there is big confusion right now because, as Christoph says, the data is coming out of these new techniques to record from more and more neurons, higher resolution, and so on. People don't know even to do the first analysis step anymore. Spike sorting doesn't work anymore. There is definitely something to grasp. Now, what I think on a more theoretical level, what this community can really contribute to neuroscience is we were used to distinguish these levels. That's the MAR level. So there was a level of algorithms and a level of implementation. And in neuroscience, often the normative theories in neuroscience, they distinguish these levels. They say, okay, it's Bayesian, somehow Bayesian reasoning. It's a Bayesian classifier. That's their comparison. And I think this community thinks about how the level of implementation, the level of algorithms work together. This is what we need, because there is an argument to be made that somehow there needs to be this match between the two levels. And neuroscientists are not that good in thinking about these connections.
Wolfgang.
Yeah, I have a similar comment. I think now we are maybe also using only kind of a small part of this knowledge about the brain, because I think there is a lot of really very good insight from cognitive science and also from systems neuroscience, whereas I think here in this neuromorphic community, there's a strong bias towards things on the microscopic level than looking at neurons and synapses. And I think to see the other side of the coin, you might want to look at this review paper which appeared last year in Neuron, where the first author is Demis Hassabis, so the head of Google DeepMind, and Matthew Botvinnik, also Google DeepMind, formerly professor for neuroscience and cognitive science in Princeton, are the authors. And they argue actually that they have really the goal at Google DeepMind, this is, as Demis Hassabis describes, to crack intelligence. They're not about deep learning, they're far beyond this. At the moment, for example, their key goal is to evoke imagination and the functional capability of imagination in devices. And I think this is, for example, really could be inspiring for this community also, that one goes beyond MNIST and the usual repertoire of tasks and is a little bit bolder, goes about, really ask ourselves what is really characteristic for intelligence, like imagination and planning, and then captures these things then. And they also argue in this paper, this is also why I mentioned this, is that actually they argue being actually also really informed about the brain, that at the moment the state of neuroscience, we don't learn so much about the level of neurons and synapses, and we should rather focus on this higher levels of organization of the brain, for example, hierarchical reinforcement, learning how different brain areas act together, and that maybe we can learn more about this. So I don't want to say this exclusively, but it just says there's another side of the coin which we tend to ignore in neuromorphic engineering, and we might really foster this a bit more by also inviting speakers from this area, people like Josh Tenenbaum or other people, even from Google DeepMind or so, to also give us a challenge really to look at other aspects about knowledge about the brain.
Yes, I fully agree. Yeah,
I just wanted to make a contrast. You said we know so little.
I didn't say that. I repeated it.
And the neuroscientist beside me said, we know so much about neuroscience. That I think what the issue is that we really don't know what's important about neuroscience. We don't know how much of this vast field we can sort of safely ignore, and how much we need to absorb and incorporate and develop and build on. And that sort of brings me to a comment about atoms, because I was trained as a physicist. And there was, in fact, ample evidence, mostly from chemistry, that atoms do exist before Boltzmann and Gibbs and all of that community.
But the physicists hadn't gotten it.
Okay, it's time to get input from the audience. And Steve.
Hello. So I think this lines up with the discussion that's been going on around the table, but I'd like to sort of give you a little bit of additional input. I mean, one comment that really struck me in yesterday's panel session was Terry Sejnowski's reaction to the suggestion that the brain was a bit of a hack. Okay, and Terry came back very strongly saying, no, you know, the brain works so well, it has to be based on principles. And this has kind of been my instinct, okay? I'm a transistor hacker. I design chips. But the way we build computing machinery that works reliably is by having very deeply embedded principles upon which to build those machines. And my view is if you try and build a complex system without principles, it'll never work, okay? So I was very struck by Terry's point. And so I think we need to be looking for those principles. And the neuromorphic platforms are basically just big test beds for testing hypotheses. So our job as neuromorphs is to engineer test platforms that work robustly. And we're looking to other people to bring hypotheses to test. An example, I think, of a good set of principles is the set that Jeff Hawkins elucidates. I mean, he talks about his hierarchical temporal memory, and he gives you a list of principles upon which that model's based. Now, I don't think that model is, you know, the final description of the brain, but I think the point I'm trying to make is that the basis of that model is a set of very clear principles, and that's what we're looking for. We'd like the theoreticians, the computational neuroscientists, to start coming up with clear principles and principles that can be tested, and we have the machines to test them. Okay, so discuss.
So I just wanted to comment on Steve's.
Okay, your next break.
Okay. Yes. Oh, it's already on. You're assigning the job to neuroscientists to tell you what the principles are, which is fair from your point of view. Fair enough, but I'm going to kick it back. No, I think without the chips, without the devices that will allow us to really explore these systems theoretically, I think we're dead in the water. I think the hope we have is that we're finally going to have the compute we need to really explore these biological mechanisms that are just computationally out of reach. Deep learning has succeeded because it's within reach. And without the new hardware, we can't explore the range of hypotheses out there. You can't do it you just can't simulate 1 million biologically realistic neurons on a digital computer, or even, you just can't.
Okay, Brett and then Rick.
So where you went is, where you started is where I was going to go, and then you went in a different direction. So I actually think, okay, personal story here. I went to Sandia to work in a computing center as a neuroscientist because I actually think that neuroscience suffers from a lack of constraints on the theory side. I actually think this community, maybe broadly speaking, this community is well suited to provide a constraint to neuroscience theory. I believe the brain does computation. It makes sense for a group of people interested in computation to go to neuroscience and say, I need theories of the brain that are constrained by computation. And I think that, certainly, I think all of the neural computations we've talked about are probably not good models of the brain. But if we do it correctly, we can bias the neuroscientists that we work with, or the neuroscientists among us, to come up with new theories that actually impact the diseases of computation of the brain that NIH cares about, for instance. So I think that we cannot rely on the neuroscience community to just to come up with theories and solve it all. I think we can provide them a foundation for theories that are both useful for us, but also useful for them. And I think we have a great opportunity for that.
I'm just going to make a comment. I spent 20 years working in genomics, and there was a fallacy early on that if we sequence the human, suddenly we will understand the human. And the way that we get insights in genomics is by doing comparative analysis, right? We've now sequenced thousands of different organisms, and we can see what evolution keeps and what evolution is willing to throw away. And I think in neuroscience, the same thing, some version of that approach has to be pursued. If you compare brain morphology, brain structure, brain function across many species, you find differences and you find commonalities. And in some sense, the neuromorphic opportunity is to build many different devices and find out the common set of things they can do with different assumptions and compare that to the common set of things that biology-based neurons or nervous systems can do despite their differences. I think that's how you find these common design principles. I think the challenge that we get fascinated by intelligence, unfortunately, we don't have very many examples for comparative intelligence. And I think that's might be a fool's errand at some level. I really agree with the DeepMind vision of solving intelligence and then using it to do interesting things. But if we actually want to come up with principles, we're either purely in theory or we have to do some kind of comparative analysis, I think.
I would like to come back to 2 points that were mentioned in the first round, which I found very interesting and I think we haven't really discussed so far. I mean, one is what Wolfgang said about how would we judge that the systems we build have an interesting performance. I mean, we are all very much forced into, by our funding agencies or by our people that finance our work, into solving benchmarks that conventional computers also do, like, I don't know, like MNIST or ImageNet or all these things. And if you want to succeed in the field, you have to be better in some way. On the other hand, we know that those benchmarks are not really what makes the brain special. And Wolfgang mentioned things like imagination and planning. And I think it would be very good if we could better formulate how success in those areas could be determined.
So I guess regarding benchmarks, I have a comment. And this is really, for a long time in neuroscience, the behavioral paradigms that were studied were very simplified and simple, like in vision, bar or just sine wave grading stimuli. But this is changing. And I think rather than just looking for benchmarks, like object recognition, all these very easy benchmarks, another source another thing that neuroscience can provide is actually now studying more interesting and more complex behaviors in even simple animals. And I think we should also look into these behaviors, and they might give us other ideas for benchmarks we are actually looking for. So we should not just, I think right now we are very limited because we are looking at a very small number of benchmarks.
Comment here?
Wolfgang, yeah. And then, okay, sorry. And then
one comment. I think there's a problem. I also love this exciting now experiments and in vivo imaging of mice, so why they learn. But I think there's something, there's some trivial truth we have to face. Typically, these experimental challenges are relatively simple. It takes weeks to train a mouse to do this, if they see this, and do something else. And from the computation perspective, these are all totally trivial tasks which can be solved by any neural network. As an easy exercise for undergraduate. So I think we should look more at really results about what human brains tasks the human brains can solve and they partially come from cognitive science, but also there are some recordings from human brains, fMRI data, and we should really focus on really human brain function as targets to get a little bit away out of this kind of rodent or so challenges.
Winfried?
Let me make a specific suggestion for an intelligence benchmark. Those of people here in the room have grown up in the United States probably know the books by Dr. Seuss, children's books. There is a children's book called Wacky Wednesday. It has drawings in there of normal, apparently normal daily life scenes, but there are really strange things in it, like a building floating in the air a bit, or a woman pushing a stroller on the top of a bus, these kind of things. I submit that today no AI system can look at this and find what is strange, because it requires really a good model of the world. Okay? So if I were just taking this book, asking the system to figure out what is wacky, that would be, I think, a truly workable benchmark for truly intelligent systems.
Although it's back to static image analysis. It's not sort of the spatial temporal aspect, which I think is at the end what the brain really does. We are not looking at frames or drawn images.
Good point, yes. We all agree that temporal is incredibly important. But that said, I think, so maybe it's not a complete answer to a benchmark, but I think it's a really good first step.
I have a little comment and then a question. We talked about bio-inspired models a lot, and all this information we have from neuroscience. We have to figure out, to keep with the analogy, I guess we have to figure out what information is flapping and what information is gliding, right? Because the gliding we want to keep, the flapping we don't want so much. But speaking of bio-inspired models and AI and all this stuff, we look at these image recognition things, and it's all about classification, but everybody's kind of gone back and talked about, oh, we have a toddler that can do this, we have a 3-year-old who can do this. And that there's this sense of identifying something as an object, as an animal, as this particular shape, and then identifying it as a horse. Would we have some reason to look to people like developmental psychologists and look at how they see the development of this kind of logic of classification, and maybe work with them on how we might develop more intelligent logical progressions of classification for these image identifying things?
That's a question. Anybody wants to comment? Was the question clear?
Well, I mean, I think that we should look everywhere, right? I mean, kind of that was Wolfgang's argument earlier, was it's not just the neurons and the synapses. I mean, there's a lot we can do with neurons and synapses. We're seeing that. But, development broadly, whether it's developmental psychology or developmental neuroscience, it is ironic that most of the effort in machine learning is focused on training from scratch. That's a development problem from a neuroscience point of view. So I think we definitely need to look broadly. And last year we had Gary Marcus here, who does a lot of developmental cognitive science, and was speaking in a large part to that effect, that AI is not looking into that field.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to. I'm glad you brought up Jeff Hawkins, because that book was the reason I got interested in this, and then I had the good luck to work with Dan Hammerstrom on Upside. But this idea of having a framework is the way he put it, not even a theory, but a framework to look at this. I guess I'd like to ask two questions. First, is the community in agreement that we are a hierarchical system, that we start with something that's very basic and we have abstraction? Is abstraction something you think of as key to intelligence? Okay. And the second question is, do you think that abstraction and hierarchy is going to be only cortically emergent? In other words, do you think it's going to all come from the cortex, or is it going to come from somewhere else? And if it's going to come from somewhere else, from old brain, then shouldn't that be part of the community's effort?
Fritz and then Christoph.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, often we tend to be corticocentric. So we look at cortex and we think this is kind of where the processing begins, but there's all these old parts evolutionarily of the brain. And we should never forget that there are animals who do not have a cortex and that function. I mean, it was brought up, right? And so how you might want to think about the hierarchy might be these nested loops, control loops. Maybe control is also a simplification, as we said. But the idea is there is already an existing system, and then on top of that, you build more processing. So that's another way to actually think about the hierarchies. And it's very interesting, this work by Murray Sherman and Ray Guillory, who actually show that anatomically, even V1 has actually outputs that go to motor nuclei and go to other thalamical nuclei that then project up again. So in addition to the direct cortical connections between brain regions, you do have these connections that go back to the subcortical areas and then come up again. So there's a second set of actually wiring.
Christoph. I think abstraction is really the centerpiece of intelligence. I agree very much with that statement. You know, an intelligent person is somebody who can be exposed to a completely new situation and projected onto something that relates to a totally different situation. This distance over which the person generalizes can only be spanned on a very abstract level. Leave away all the details of this situation, parse out what is essential for this kind of problem, and then you can apply it to the other. And I think one can learn from animal psychologists that humans are really ahead of animals on this level, in this direction. They have 1 or 2 or 3 levels of abstraction on top of animals, and they probably acquire that culturally. You know, the baby is born with an instinct of paying attention to the face of the mother, finding out what the emotional reaction of the mother, of the caretaker is, and finding out what the attentional focus is. And that is an antenna by which the baby learns what is important in this world and how to react to it. And that way we acquire very quickly a very high level of abstraction. And I think that's the centerpiece of intelligence.
Wolfgang?
Yeah.
Wolfgang, and then you, and then there's next.
Yeah, I also agree. I think this was a great comment to focus on abstraction, and I think it would be good if we can formulate benchmark tasks which involve this challenge then. And I think also, same opinion as Christoph there, that I think one can learn there also quite a bit from cognitive science then, observations from really newborn babies or 1.5 months, they're often old, that apparently also some kind of prerequisites for abstraction, some innate knowledge, as they call it, is already in the human brain then. And I think this is also a concrete challenge for neuromorphic devices, because we also should be able to give them this innate knowledge which enables them to leverage on this then and to build more complex, more richer abstract representations then. And this is completely missing then. I wouldn't have any idea how to put innate knowledge into a neural network. And I think this is a fundamental question, and we should work on this.
Yeah, so I almost take it as a given, because it's such solid neuroscience, that there is a hierarchy in the sensory lobe, in the parietal lobe. But what happens forward of the midbrain as you go into the prefrontal cortex, I think is much less clear. And that is where we have to start to think about different paradigms. And maybe it's not so hierarchical. Maybe it's loops of control or something of that sort. And I know of no solid experiments or theories that even explore that.
Okay, 3 more inputs now from you, and then you.
One question, since the neuroscientists would like first to simulate the models on silicon. What do you think? Is there like a threshold at which we need for memory computation, at which we start to see the capability to abstract, to build the hierarchy and all that? And is that threshold something that would be actually feasible to put on silicon? or would it still be like on a supercomputer level? I don't know.
So I don't have an answer, but I have a question that is
Well,
actually
maybe
very
you could-
similar
you
to
don't-
this.
yeah, is it related to the
Yeah,
question?
it
Okay,
is.
okay.
So take, for example, a typical brain experiment. You introduce a stimulus to the brain and it responds within 200 milliseconds. That's a typical reaction time, response time of the brain. A typical neuron fires at 10 spikes per second. If you crank it up, let's say that it goes up to 100. So that means that within, say, 10, 20 spikes, you were able to assess whether the person you saw is someone that you know, whether someone is happy or sad, and other facial features that would actually help you recognize even his emotional state. How do we do this?
Okay, to the question is Rick, I think you had, and then Brent.
I was going to say that there is a body of work on hierarchical attention networks in the deep learning space that have been able to solve many problems that people didn't think were solvable with just those two mechanisms. So I think it's very powerful. There was a question about how big does the system have to be. Some of the networks that I've played with, start to get interesting at, 10 million parameters, 10 million synapses kind of thing. Some of them are much larger than that. But 10 million synapses is doable on current hardware. So I think they have complex topologies, but I think it's within the range of what one could experiment now, but one would have to be open to trying those kinds of experiments.
So I have a personal example also. So I, a number of years ago, modeled dentate gyrus for looking at neurogenesis function, right? So it's adding new neurons in, looking at dendritic growth and so forth. And you start seeing behavior that is scale dependent, you start seeing certain behaviors at scales that are biologically realistic. So if I add new neurons to a network of a few thousand total neurons, there's effectively so much noise in the network you can't really see the effect of new neurons come in. But if you're at, say, a mouse scale, which was like 500,000, 250,000 neurons, or a rat scale, 1 million neurons, you start seeing some scale-dependent behavior. So these are highly nonlinear systems. I mean, neurons are nonlinear at many different scales. So really reduced scale models can tell you some things, but you need to get close to biologically realistic sizes if you're looking at systems, for instance. So kind of a more systems neuroscience answer is pretty similar to, I think, what Rick just said is, if you're at roughly millions of neurons, which we're hearing about some of these new platforms yesterday, we're getting close to being able to do that on a single chip. You're going to start seeing some of this emergent behavior at biologically realistic scales that we have to get there from a simulation point of view to be able to make any strong inferences about function.
Next question.
Yeah, I've got a comment and a short question. So first one, I've got a more limited experience than most of you, but in my experience, if we're trying to solve problems that biology is good at, the more biology we add into our problem-solving methods, the better our solution is. And that's certainly been my experience so far. And then the kind of question is, are we all, we're using the term intelligence a lot, and are we all operating on the same definition of intelligence? Because I'm pretty sure there's no clear definition. And for example, if we're talking about excellent memory and perfect recall of memory, my laptop is way more intelligent than me. But I think that we're talking about a lot of different intelligences when we're talking about artificial intelligence. And do we need to be more specific about that as we keep this conversation moving forward?
Fritz.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I mean, I would disagree with actually what Wolfgang said. That I mean, not disagree, but I think it's also very valuable to actually study the behavior of quite simple animals, and that are not so intelligent to us, but solve very, very sophisticated problems. And I mean, the visual system is a good example. The object recognition recognition from static imaging is from static images is the icing on the cake, so to say. What the visual system has to do, right? It's about guiding visual flow. I mean, controlling our behavior using visual flow. All these things, and very simple animals do this in amazing perfection, like a fly that navigates at pretty high speeds in a very complicated, cluttered environment without crashing. That's amazing, and I think I think we should be very broad. There's a lot of amazing capabilities of brains, and not all are associated with high intelligence in the human sense.
So in terms of the definition of intelligence, perhaps we could think of intelligence as like statisticians are thinking about randomness. So if I flip a coin, this is a random procedure for a statistician, right? But if I know or I can calculate all the physics around that coin and the air that is, how thick is the air, then I could tell you that there is a deterministic solution to that. So perhaps intelligence is something like abstract entity that we approach since we do not know the physics, and that can go all the way down to this idea of looking at small creatures that have a very small neural network. And if we can, and there are papers that show that, if we can record the entire activity of that network, we can predict the behavior.
Finally. Thank you very much for today. It was a really, really interesting day and really fun to listen to you all. I've been thinking a lot about benchmarks, and a couple of the comments that have come up had me thinking about some of the ideas that I had been thinking prior to being here today. It's my first time at this conference, and it was really interesting. So regarding intelligence, I think there are many different levels, and I think we're on the precipice of being able to create intelligence machines that mimic simple animals. Like you can train a mouse or you can train a dog to do certain things, but like when I think of intelligence, I think of higher level intelligence. So benchmarks, like the idea of taking an abstraction and applying it to something novel. As an educator, I would call that intuition. So that seems like a reasonable benchmark for higher level intelligence. Other ones, I'm curious what you, if there's any thoughts on this, is deception, for example. There are different types of deception. One is to deceive someone and achieve a personal goal, but I also think of a different type of deception as being a joke that you tell. You're misleading a person for the purpose of getting them to laugh at you. So what do you think of that as a type of benchmark?
I think it's a good one. I mean, humor is a very good. I think, yeah.
I would love, yeah. I guess as a comment, I would love to hear thoughts.
So the conversations make me a little nervous because, to me, intelligence is the fact that we can do all of these things. It's almost the generalization comment you mentioned earlier. It's being stuck in something new. I was not personally. I only became impressed by DeepMind's work with AlphaGo. When they show that their training could transfer learn into other tasks. Simply getting a computer science solution to solve a problem once defined clearly, it's impressive within that problem, but if we're talking about human-like intelligence, we really need to be looking for something that's a lot more general than one specific task or even 10 specific tasks. And I get a little nervous about saying, well, let's set a few benchmarks on that. I know benchmarks are necessary for assessment reasons, but people will hack benchmarks. They always do in machine learning.
Interesting.
I guess my question is around the idea that we can't do without these super expensive machines. We cannot actually get to a point where we can see that emergent behavior that was mentioned previously. So by comparison, deep learning, 2012, right? The guy comes up with a paper and he used 2 GPUs that anybody can afford to prove that his algorithm can scale, can learn. But the idea that is popular here is that I, as a small entity, I will never be able to make advancements without these super expensive machines. Is that true or false?
Well, I said 1 million neurons, so I mean, a simulation of a few million neurons you could probably do with 2 modern GPUs, and certainly with one of Steve's Spinnaker boards.
Yeah, I mean, I want to make up with it's free, and it's available, and there's a big effort now to really spread these technologies to the community. It's also, if you say super expensive, it's actually not super expensive if you compare it to investment in a satellite or something like that. And I think finding out what the principles of brain computations are probably comparable, should be comparable at least with the investment into a satellite. So I don't think it's too expensive.
Well, actually,
Now, it's not guaranteed to be easy. Like,
Yeah, that's the problem.
you have to, neuroscience is hard, but.
Well, actually, somebody mentioned yesterday $100,000 only for power, for running a few experiments in neuroscience. So.
Yeah, well, lab experiments.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a comment about benchmarking. And one thing I'll throw out is the ability to solve problems. I don't know how many of you have seen the YouTube video of crows retrieving food. So there's some sort of nut floating on the water in a cylinder, and there's a few stones lying around. The crow obviously wants to get at the nut, and the way it gets the nut is to pick up the stones, drop it in the liquid until the level rises enough so that it can pick the nut off the top of the liquid. That, I don't know how many, I ask this, I don't know how many neurons a crow has, but that ability to solve problem is definitely a benchmark, that sort of framework we should be thinking of.
May I just follow on that?
Sure, yeah. Sorry.
So that's interesting, the crows. So about rodents, so in our research institute, so we always do rodent experiments by raising them in a cage, and they don't have any sensory input. Every day is the same. So there's this, I think, big change happening right now that we want to build a realistic environment for them to perform realistic tasks. And I realized there was an attempt before, like in University of California, one of the schools. This project is called Lab Rats Gone Wild, and they raised the lab rats in the desert, and with a cage, and there are predators, there are natural weathers, and there are really amazing things start to happen. Like, so you put these lab rats in the desert, and then the babies, the pups, open their eyes really quickly, early, like 2 days early, and also their cortical representation of like limbs of the body is entirely different compared to lab rats. So they have a large part of the cortex dedicated to the tail. And if you watch the video of the lab rats walking around, they actually use the tail to wrap onto like some branch and drink water, like heads down. So they use a lot of different body parts. But in lab rats, their representation, the most is like the front paws, because they just do this grooming and very kind of a boring life. So we're trying to have some kind of smart environment for them to navigate.
Okay, I have a comment on operating principles of the brain. I think I probably should have raised this a little earlier, but I'm organizing my thought. So before I just put up my argument, like 2 disclaimers. Number 1, I was a neuroscientist before I was a neuromorphic engineer, and I was a neuromorphic engineer before I became a deep learning researcher. Okay, so number 2 is this is maybe provocative, but it's never intended to be contentious. Okay, here it goes. So, I mean, there's a quote of Terry yesterday, basically saying the brain has to have some principles. And being a neuroscientist, I've been always after that. And I think even in the deep learning field, everybody agrees intelligence has some underlying principles. And that's, if you know that, that's probably a very good way to engineer it. But after all, we're doing engineering. So I want to quote Terry's another a comment yesterday. basically, one of the, our favorite examples in history is the steam engine that was, predated more than a century before the laws of thermodynamics. And I want to add to that more historical facts is that it was a century earlier. And the thermodynamic laws are only became necessary to be found out when internal combustion engines came to be. So that is not to say during that whole century, steam engines didn't really advance in any way. But engineers are building them by intuition, not really guided by theory. And they don't really know where the limits are. So I would say deep learning probably is at the same stage. It really works really well. And I would argue that maybe like they say, there may be an industrial revolution looming, and without really knowing the principles. And I think the same kind of discussion was also present at NIPS a few months ago. This is basically whether we need a theoretical rigor to advance the field. Is any kind of voodoo tricks that you could do to build your system has to wait until we fully understand all the underlying principles. So that's my comment.
Well, the obvious answer is need both.
Rick is first.
I was going to say, yeah, at that meeting, Jan argued that the theorists are always trying to catch up. And if we get far enough ahead with the raw engineering till we get ourselves into trouble, then they know what to focus on, right? So I think that's basically consistent with what you said. So I think the challenge needs to be to get into as much trouble as possible with systems that seem to be able to do amazing things with us not understanding how they work, and that'll motivate the theorists to get their act together.
Brad and then Fritz.
Well, I was going to basically say the same thing. I mean, need to have both, right? I mean, theory without anybody trying to put into practice is fairly useless. And engineering, eventually the laws of thermodynamics were fully well characterized, right? I mean, you really have to have both going in parallel. And I think I don't think anyone's going to disagree with that.
Fritz.
I would also say it's just a fair arm race. I mean, one does not prevent the others from being done. And sometimes theory can lead something. Sometimes people just stumble across good solutions.
Manfred.
Since we are in the search of a list of principles, should be the capability to make predictions not be high on that list? For example, that crow had to make a prediction that it drops stone, the water will rise. So I think this would be one of the fundamental principles. Brain should be a prediction engine, is a prediction engine.
The answer is probably yes, but
So I have a question. And that is, presumably somewhere along the way, the crow saw liquid rise and decided that, well, maybe this will work. But that required the triggering of some memory. Do neuroscientists know how memories are triggered?
Yes and no. I mean, we know stuff about memory.
That's the memory person.
Well, we have simple models for it like you initialize a Hopfield network.
Okay, next question.
Okay, let me see if I can put this the right way. Okay, so there's a famous child psychologist that tests the theory of mind, and there's some age where a child can interpret what's happening in reality the way an adult can. For example, the example I'm thinking of is that you have two glasses of different heights, and the volume of water is constant. You pour it in from the small glass to the tall glass, and younger children will be confused and think that the taller glass has more water. And at some point, something clicks, and the child reaches some ability to say, oh no, it's the same amount of water, even though it looks different in the glass. So I guess my question is, thinking about intelligence as the emergence of a new algorithm in the substrate of the mind, of the brain, that enables the intelligent being to kind of have some enlightenment or new awareness or something. And I think we have a lot of this, trying to construct algorithms, trying top-down, model how the brain thinks and solves problems rather than how can we design something that's going to let new algorithms just kind of maybe pop up out of thin air I don't know. I don't know, is that a question? Kind of.
I would like to go back to what Wolfgang said. Animals come into this world with a repertoire of behavior. And ethologists study that, and they have great stories about that. Like, for instance, little cats have this instinct of following a quickly moving object and pounce it. And that's an element for mouse catching, of course, but they don't know about mice yet. At first, they just, even with mice, they just pounce at them and prefer them to run again because they can continue their game. So maybe we are born with elements of algorithms, you call them, of behavioral patterns, and they are abstract enough to fit into whatever environment. They are concrete enough to fire every now and then. You know, it's a kind of memory that gets excited by a stimulus. And there seems to be a mechanism for the animal to be able to put together such building blocks into more complex behavioral patterns.
Okay. As we are slowly approaching the end of this session, I would like to come back to one statement that was made in the initial round, which we never ever commented on, which I found very interesting. It's what you said about the idea of having an institute, as you say, where biologists and those working on AI in the broader sense actually come together and work together. I think that is a very important idea, and can only tell you we had a project a couple of years ago, more than 10 years ago, where this has actually worked very well. It was in Europe, it was the Facets project, which to me was kind of the ideal case where two areas met and actually produced young people that made a career in the field and now have, I think, both ways of thinking. And to have something like that on the wider scale would be very good. Maybe you comment a little bit on your idea and how you see this. I mean, you would be an ideal person to set this up and get this going.
Yeah, so always, so I've been thinking about this. So I work with a lot of experimental neuroscientists. So first, I found it to be really hard to convince either side. So neuroscience and machine learning AI is two large fields with very distinct mindsets. So typically, I talk to neuroscientists and talk to them about AI. So we can learn a lot about AI. Like AlphaGo it's very cool, and they think, so they often say it's only engineering and we do science. And then I ask about AI researchers, okay, so we can learn a lot of maybe some algorithmic inspirations from the brain, and they say, okay, it's biology, it's constrained, there's some biochemistry, and we can learn little things from the brain. So it has been very strong pushback from either side. But I think it's fundamentally important. It's so apparent that biological intelligence and artificial intelligence are all intelligence, and I think another thing I believe is elegant solutions tend to converge. And also there's a talk by Demis Hassabis. He believed he needs to understand the brain, how the brain works for better AI. It's because he believed and artificial general intelligence solutions, the space is very sparse. So it's really hard to stumble upon a human-level AGI. And yeah, of course, if you have a lot of solutions nearby, you can just do random search. But it seems that evolution only produced a human-level AGI once. So it seems studying the brain and studying AI together is a very important thing to do intrinsically. And also, the segregation is really hard. So that's why I think there needs to be an institution that. So I think my advisor told me right now is that sometimes even like working together is not enough. Like there need to be one person have both fields in the same brain. So you can't just, if you train two different neural networks and you can't just combine them together and hope they will perform well for both together. I think it needs to be retrained in a way. So that's my thinking. And hopefully I think in the future there'll be a research institution that produce PhDs major in intelligence instead of neuroscience or AI.
Can I try to address the audience? Because this is really something which concerns those who are at the beginning of their careers. Can I ask, who is actually under 30 here? Who is under 30? Can I ask those to come to the front and make a comment on what Weinan just said? If you are under 30, please come to the microphone and say what you think about this. You're under 30. Come on, make a statement. There was one in the back. Show your passports. I don't believe this.
Okay. Could you repeat the statement one time?
He was tweeting.
Sorry.
Could you repeat the statement really quick, or summarize it?
Well, I think his idea is that one should have some kind of institute, whatever that means, where maybe you say it much better.
Yeah. So I think the bottom line is that there need to be a dedicated branch. I'm not saying that all the neuroscience and AI should be combined together, but there need to be an institution dedicated in cracking intelligence. They do neuroscience and AI with the same graduate students, and they do neuroscience experiment with the aim of solving intelligence, and they do AI to improve their understanding of the brain, and sort of form this recursive loop for the fastest development in both fields, I think.
I think the key to that, one of the things that I noticed a lot is everybody's always talking about interdisciplinary work, but I don't see too much of people stepping across the boundary of the STEM fields into fields like sociology, psychology, and things that people deal with daily. And I think they have a lot to do with each other, especially with respect to intelligence. I'm a mathematician, but I'm doing mathematical neuroscience, and I agree. I think something like that, where we talk about the real foundations of intelligence, I think that's a really concrete and important example of ways that we can really push interdisciplinary study, and I think it'd be a great thing to have for students right now. Immediately. Yeah.
Okay, just listen to comments. Then you, and then you.
So I think it's an interesting point because I myself am a graduate student in a Center for Complex Systems and Brain Sciences. I got my undergraduate degree in biology, and now I work on sparse coding and neurobiological algorithms. But centers are notoriously bad at collaborating. That's what they're supposed to be about. But you have I even see this in my own center. You have people that work on biology and people that work on math in the same building on the same floor, but they just work on their math. They just work on their biology, and they meet up passing each other in the hallway. They don't actually work together on anything. So I think there has to be a new field. There has to be a new study, a new undergraduate field, like intelligence or something, where you learn also this composite information. We have to create something new.
Yes.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. So my point would be that it's actually hard. It's hard to comprehend all the things because it's a mix. It's a really mix of if you look at today's presentation, we've seen chemistry. We often get comments about physics, like Boltzmann machines, energy. So what is probably, and it means that in order to study intelligence, you probably need very good basic education, fundamental. You need a very, very solid basement in many areas like chemistry, physics, mathematics, philosophy, because at the end, intelligence is also about philosophy and about, we have philosophy of mind and these things. But the question is how to get to this point in, say, a limited amount of time. You have 4 years, and you need to get the solid basis.
Yeah, let him comment, and then we ask the older guys.
Yeah, so I don't have an answer. It's just I see the need that I feel like this merging need to happen for any significant speed up in the process. And one thing I just want to give a concrete example, and I think, so I read a paper on training a recurrent neural network to perform a spatial navigation task. And this is pure AI, machine learning people who wrote the paper. And they trained this neural network, and then they added 2 regularizations. So first, they added noise, and second, they regularized the number of cells it can allow to fire. So adding these 2, and suddenly the neurons firing fields start to show great cell firing patterns. So that's amazing to me, because I studied the hippocampus, and we see this great cell firing in the entorhinal cortex all the time, and we don't have a clue. We have some theories, but to see a simple, naive, recurrent neural network adding realistic constraints can generate this elegant solution that's similar in the brain, I think that's very inspiring to me. So I have a lot of such examples, like backpropagation through dendrites and maybe deep learning in the brain. So I think there's many things we can gain from the merging. At least we can see that for now.
Christoph and Fritz.
I'm not under 30, but I would like to...
Yeah, now is your time.
I would like to
we have 5 minutes
respond to your request. Here's a very crazy idea. You know, we are part of an aging culture, and the strength of that civilization is of having developed very specialized fields which are highly professional in what they do, but the weakness of that system is that they have grown out of contact with each other. I have gone, all my life, I've gone through all these different fields that study the brain, philosophy and linguistics and neurology and engineering and computer science, and it's a large number of them. And the impetus that we are all exposed to work in an interdisciplinary fashion is an empty kind of impetus, because in order to get into a journal, to get into a conference, in order to get your money, you have to be one of those professionals. And if we want to reach your ideal, we have to form an institute that is populated by people that are way under 30, and they get something like a general education. And sometimes, I don't know whether it still exists in some universities, students can go in some special courses on general education, and they get non-specialized education in the style in which those philosophers of the 17th century have written, Hume and Locke and Spinoza and Leibniz, and you can read them all. They had no specialization. They could talk across the board.
But did they ever achieve anything?
Pardon?
Did they ever achieve anything?
I think they have set. I think they have set the stage to this day here. We are still inheriting that. They have achieved a lot, I think. And I've just read a book about the rediscovery of a very ancient text of 50 years before our time reckoning, Lucretius. He had a very, very modern view on, he talked about atoms, of course. We are nothing but atoms. We come together and we flow again. And that was 2,000 years ago, and we still owe a lot to him. So my proposal is to form an institute that allows only very young people into it, and a changing number of people who older people who can teach them for very brief periods in their specialty.
Very brief talks, for example. But that will be a wonderful end of the discussion, but I still have Fritz on the list. You get the last word now, and then we have the buses are waiting now.
So, I think also it's a good idea, but I would cast the notion of intelligence much wider. I would say intelligence is really what brains, interesting behavior that brains can do and machines can't. Historically, it's very interesting that there was this divide between neuroscience and machine learning in around 1990. And so I think times have changed so much. I mean, the data that you have presented, there's now a lot of inspiration, I agree, which is now graspable, which was not graspable back then. And I think it's good, and also the idea to have young people, and also to be very open, to have just people join this, maybe, having possibilities that people do remotely projects. So it should be a very open thing, I think, maybe not just a typical academic institute.
Absolutely, final statement.
Yeah, so I think, I'm 31 years old.
Oh.
And no, I'm about 30. And I did 5 years of PhD in studying ion channels, 3 years of a postdoc studying ion channels. And I decided to spend the next 5 years fully, I have no solid mathematics background, and I wanted to spend the next 5 years to be really good at AI and machine learning. I think the age really doesn't matter. Like, we are living longer and longer. If we solve AI, we're going to live for much longer. So I think we should keep the mindset of risk-taking and lifelong learning. So we should keep learning whenever.
Great, wonderful.